back in September 2015 was actually when they built the first running prototypes of the LT6 engine. What's up YouTube? Today I'm going to be covering some updates from the Z06 Dealer Tour. I'm also going to cover the dealer workbench leak for the order system. I've got some interesting information around the C8 Z06 break-in procedure for the LT6 engine. Then I'm going to be talking about the deep dive presentation that Chevy did for the LT6 engine. And last, we're going to follow up with a quick spotlight about one of my subscribers' cars who sent in some pictures to me. I'm going to cover a lot of interesting information, so let's get right into it. Alright, so let's start out by talking about the Z06 Dealer Tour. There are a lot more talented photographers than myself who have excellent photos of these cars, so I'm going to be showing those while I'm talking through. As I covered in last week's video, the C8 Z06s are making their way across the country, seemingly from East Coast to West Coast. Starting first with Ciocca and McMulkin, they've now hit several different dealerships, and that tour continues and likely will continue for quite a while. Everybody who I've talked to who's attended or seen the cars in person thought it was a really worthwhile experience. Getting to touch some of the fabrics and the leather inside the car, seeing all the different options on display, getting a chance to ask questions to some of the Corvette staff that are traveling with the cars, as well as just getting an overall sense of how the car looks, how it looks in different light, what the paint looks like, all the different wheel and seat and trim options. And by all accounts online, the reception's been equally positive. I've seen in a lot of different groups people being very excited that they got a chance to see the car. I've heard very little in the way of negatives, and a lot of those negatives tend to be really more around speculation and things that haven't been announced yet, such as the pricing, rather than the actual cars themselves. I think all of us can agree these things really are a masterpiece. It does seem that seeing the car in person has sort of caused a resurgence in interest in the car, as well as a lot more people jumping onto reservation lists trying to get their spot in line. This is good for Chevy because it's building more buzz for the car, as if there wasn't enough already, and it's getting the car out and in front of more people so they can share their opinions and celebrate what's going to be a really awesome car. One of the best parts of the dealer tour, in my opinion, is that it gives you a chance to see the car in person, and it helps sort of reaffirm the fact that you're going to be spending a lot of money on the car. That took away any shadow of a doubt I had about the car, and just made me more excited. It's going to make that long wait until you take delivery seem a lot better because you know what you're going to get at the end of it. Next, we're going to talk about the ordering workbench leak. So last week, some news came out, there were some screenshots floating around, and it turns out for a short period of time at Chevy dealerships, you were able to go into the ordering system and actually see all the different options that were going to be for the 2023 Stingrays as well as the Z06. I believe this was corrected pretty quickly thereafter, however it did give some interesting insight into the upcoming cars. While there weren't any big surprises in that information, there were a couple things probably worth noting. First is that the 70th anniversary white paint color is actually going to be called Abalone White Tri-Coat. There are also going to be auto-leveling headlights. And then lastly, for prospective Stingray buyers, the Level 2 carbon fiber interior package is actually not going to be offered for the Stingray. It appears, based on these screenshots, that that's only going to be offered for the Z06. I know there were a lot of people that were excited about that potentially making it over to the Stingray, but that doesn't appear to be the case here. The fact that this information leaked out is not a real surprise. As we get closer to the dates where Chevy can actually place orders in the system, Chevy's got to obviously prepare for that, and this is likely just part of that preparation. Somebody checked a box that set things visible that wasn't quite ready yet. And as a reminder, the initial pre-orders can start going in on March 24th, and then the actual ordering system opens up somewhere between March 31st and April 5th. So the clock is ticking, we're only about a month away. Next, I want to talk about the engine break-in procedure for the LT6 engine that's going to be in the C8 Z06. My source for this is John at Mid-Engine Corvette Forum. He apparently reached out to Chevy to ask about differences between the C8 Stingray's break-in procedures and the new motor in the C8 Z06, specifically in regards to RPM. So Chevy's response included that the first 500 miles the car will be limited to 6,600 RPM for redline, and on the dashboard the LCD display will reflect that as well, much like the current C8 does for its own break-in procedure. Of note, that 6,600 RPM is essentially the redline for the regular C8 Stingray, so that's a pretty high RPM for a break-in procedure. Certainly enough to have some fun with. Upon a little more follow-up, John was able to get a little bit more information, and that included that Chevy doesn't recommend doing any track driving until you've put 1,500 miles on the car. I'm going to quote here so I get it right. We are not just breaking in the motor, but importantly your gears, bearings, and the differential. So we strongly advise no track usage on the Z06 until, just like the Stingray, you put 1,500 miles on it. This sounds pretty good to me, and it's going to give you a little bit of time to get used to the car before you're really pushing it. So I don't see any downsides there. I think there will be a lot of people who are going to burn through those miles as quickly as they can so they can really unlock the potential of the car. Alright, so for the next part of this video, I want us all to put on our engineering hats because we're going to go on a little bit of a deep dive into the LT6 engine. Most of you are pretty familiar with some of the headline figures about the power, the the torque, and the high RPM redline that the engine has. We've all been told that it's a masterpiece of an engine. It's the highest horsepower naturally aspirated V8 that's been made in a production car. There's a lot of pretty big headlines for it. However, there's a lot more that goes into this than just the headline figures, and under the covers there's a lot of things that people may not realize, as well as really speak to the intent that Chevy has with this car. This past week, several different outlets got a chance to see an internal presentation from Chevy detailing the design process, some of the internal targets, as well as a lot of information that hadn't previously been released about the car. I have several different sources for this information. John at Mid-Engine Corvette Forum, and then on YouTube, Vet Titans as well as Speed Phenom both did overviews with the actual presentation, sharing the slides as they went. So I've gone through all the information in the presentation and distilled out some of the parts that I thought were really interesting that people might not be aware of, as well as things that actually will have a real-world impact on you when you're driving the car. So first, let's start out with a couple of the LT6 Program Objectives. Chevy had three main priorities when they were designing this engine. The first is naturally aspirated power. They wanted to have a very consistent experience lap after lap so that you could run the car as long as you wanted without any degradation in performance. In this case, that means no more heat soak for a Z06. Next, they wanted the LT6 to have a very unique character specific to the car. They wanted you to see, hear, and feel the difference of this car versus anything else that they've ever released under the Corvette name. And then last, they wanted to have exhilarating performance. They said this engine must be thrilling in every sense, and it was the biggest priority of the three. Throughout their design and engineering process, they benchmarked some of the very best engines out there. McLaren, Ferrari, and Porsche all were names that they mentioned as engines that they were comparing to. The entire engine design project was internally codenamed Gemini, after the famous connection between NASA and Corvette. You may not be familiar, but early astronauts in NASA all drove Corvettes or were gifted Corvettes as being part of that program. Throughout the engine, there are references to Gemini, including a little rocket icon that they've put on a lot of different pieces of the engine. In some cases, anywhere where they needed an arrow to designate direction or orientation, they've used a Gemini logo instead. It turns out there are 54 of these rocket icons hidden throughout the engine, so as you start tinkering with your car, you'll definitely run across a few of them. The next interesting part of the presentation was that the long-awaited horsepower and torque curves were actually graphed out so that you could see them. Peak power of 670 horsepower happens at 8,400 RPM, on the way to a red line of 8,600 RPM. Peak torque of 460 pound-feet happened at 6,300 RPM. Now I found this interesting. The weight of the LT6 is only 1 kilogram heavier than the LT2, but it makes 175 more horsepower. And the LT6 is 14 kilograms heavier than the LT5 that was in the C8 Z06, but makes 20 more horsepower. So that gives you a little bit of a frame of reference. Now for lubrication, there's a 7-stage oil pumping process. There are 6 scavenging pumps and then 1 main supply pump. Now that may not sound very interesting, but the real-world application of all those pumps allow you to take a sustained 1.25 Gs of lateral and fore and aft acceleration for any amount of time while still providing maximum lubrication to the engine. This means you can drive the car really hard and you're never going to be starved for oil. While also on lubrication, the oil cooler offers 85% more cooling capacity than on the LT4. After engine assembly is completed, each engine is run through a 20-minute dyno session where they're put under full load to make sure that they reach the desired performance and have no issues. This next point I found really interesting. Way back in September 2015 was actually when they built the first running prototypes of the LT6 engine. Keep in mind that was only the second year of production for the C7 and that the C8 Z06 had come out that year. So Chevy's been thinking about this motor specifically for a very long time. Now for everybody who says race technology for the street and just throws that term around, the LT6 and the LT6R motors are a lot closer in comparison than you might think. Both the production LT6 and the LT6R motor share a lot of the same components and the same foundation. The cylinder block and heads, the fuel system, and the entire valve train are all identical. They're the same part number in the race car as well as the street car. The biggest differences between them cited by Chevy are packaging for putting it in a race car, as well as the balance of performance adjustments that they need to make for professional racing. Now we're going to move on to the exhaust. One of the more interesting parts out of the entire presentation centered around the design of the exhaust and how they were able to make it sound better for the drivers. During the unveil and some of the initial information on the car, you may remember that the designers said that they took special effort to make sure that the car sounded as good inside for the driver and passenger as it did from the outside. So while they were designing it, after they did some packaging and noise analysis, they determined that a short quad pipe with a separately mounted bezel arrangement was the best approach. The presentation shared some very interesting images that showed you the different configurations they considered for reflecting that sound back to the driver. After a bunch of testing, they arrived at putting the exhaust inside the bezel was the best way to reflect that sound while still carrying the exhaust gases where they needed to go. Now when you look at the exhaust and you see those 4 tips on the back, you you may not realize that there are essentially two different exhaust systems in the car. They work in concert with the different modes, but there's some really interesting things that happen depending on what mode you're in. When the exhaust valves are closed, the exhaust routes through quite a bit of additional plumbing on the outsides of the car in order to drop down the sound of the engine. This quiets the car considerably. Now, when you open the exhaust valves through some of the settings in the car, things change completely. It essentially acts like an open straight pipe on the two middle pipes. And you can see in some of their diagrams, there's a significant amount of exhaust flow going through those two center tips. So depending on the mode, it's actually like having two different exhaust systems on your car. Now I want to take a second and talk about the cooling for the car. There's 50% more cooling capacity than the Stingray Z51 has. There's 5 total radiators, and then the fans behind those radiators are actually 50% more powerful than the ones on the Stingray. Those wider side openings in front of the rear tires also provide 20% better airflow for cooling the radiators behind those. And all of this was done without limiting the space in the front trunk or lowering the effectiveness of the air conditioning for passengers. Alright, you may remember in my last video that I said that if people wanted to send in a picture or two of their car, ideally with them in the photo, that I would start featuring some of these cars on my channel. And that's exactly what I've done. Today we've got a C5R with a 427 from one of my subscribers named Sully. You'll see that it's got an etching of a 7-liter displacement, and I bet this thing sounds amazing. From one of the photos it says it's got 650 horsepower as well as 600 pound-feet of torque. So this thing's a monster, and that's a pretty light car, so I bet it's a handful, but a lot of fun. Looks like a lot of fun, Sully. Thanks for sending the picture. If you're interested in seeing your own car on my channel, any make or model is fine as long as it's something you enjoy. Please send an email to fredsfullthrottle@gmail.com. I can't promise that I'm going to post everybody's car. It depends how many submissions I get, but each week I'll do a spotlight on somebody's car. I thought it'd be fun to celebrate all the cars that we enjoy in addition to the C8 Z06. So over the next couple weeks, I'm going to start diving into the deeper options of the C8 Z06, talking about the pros, cons, my impressions, and hopefully this will help you and myself decide what options on the car make sense and which ones we can pass on. So I hope you enjoyed this, and until next time, Fred out!